Hello. We are now in day 7, and we're going to look at the very idea of there being some sort of notion of the wilderness. And why that's interesting, why it's important for us, is because wilderness is usually seen since the interwar period, at the very least, as something which is unspoiled, natural, the very opposite of everything human, and a place that has intrinsic value. However, that's not how it began. The idea of wilderness has changed dramatically over time, and we'll be looking at the ways in which that's happened. So, in 1964 in America, they came up with the Wilderness Act, and it defined wilderness as the area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. Now, of course, this was before gender-inclusive language, but fundamentally the idea is it's what humans haven't touched. And this is something I think most people would still think, that wilderness is something that at best is visited by human beings and leaves a light touch. At the very least, you pick up all your rubbish and so forth. Now, the idea of wilderness is an old one. It comes originally from Old English, which means it's a Germanic word, and it means Wilddaornis, the place of wild animals. Daor is the cognate with deer in English. It just basically means a beast, an animal. In German, that's Tier. So in the Germanic traditions, wildnis means forested lands, and wildor means wild animals or wild game, something that could be hunted. And it generally meant forests without people. To give you an idea, the Bible, when it was translated into English, refers to a desert, a tract of solitude and savageness. The wilderness was not a nice place. It was somewhere to be avoided, as you'll know from every Grimm's fairy tale that ever got read to you, whether in bowdlerized fashion or in the original. But the modern idea of wilderness is a romanticized notion. It's something that is coherent, it has its own integrity, its own value, it's a place of spiritual refreshment. Excuse me, my cat is asking for something. And in particular, Henry David Thoreau wrote a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods, and that's been very, very significant for the American ideas of wilderness. Now, Thoreau didn't exactly go into the wild parts of America. He lived for 2 years at Walden Pond, which is a small forested area with a lake in the middle and a cabin. And he had food delivered, he had his laundry done, he had visitors, he was not alone. Nevertheless, this romantic view of the wild became the foundation for what people thought about natural land. And he wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." This is one of the most quoted passages in American literature. Now, in the course of this book, he advocated for conserving natural resources, but it wasn't so much conserving them untouched. It was conserving them for human usage, so that people could go into the wild, into the forests, and commune with nature effectively. And remember Demalet and his Hindu wise man? Well, here's Thoreau doing much the same thing. In the morning I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. And I doubt that if philosophy is not to be referred to a previous state of existence, so remote is its sublimity from our conceptions. Start again. And I doubt if that philosophy is not to be referred. Okay. I lay down with the book and go to the well for water, and lo, there I meet the servant of the Brahman, priest of Brahma and Vishnu and Indra, who still sits in his temple on the Ganges reading the Vedas, or dwells at the root of a tree with his crust and water joke. I meet his servant and come to draw water for his master, and our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. Obviously. And in Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm's Deutsches Wörterbuch, wildness acquires a particular meaning, which is anything that is separate from civilization. Now, this is a dual property. It's not just a sanctuary, it's not just a place of spiritual repose, it's also alien and inhospitable. Now, the Grimm brothers, of course, are responsible for the Grimm's fairy tales, so they would have been very familiar with the earlier version. We have a quote here from a historian of ecology who wrote that vast, largely unmodified regions would be very close to absolute wilderness, according to this older view. The North American continent prior to settlement serves as an example. It was immense in area, and its Indians were regarded as a form of wildeor, that is, wild animals, whose savageness was consistent with the character of wild country. The New World was also wilderness at the time of discovery because the Europeans considered it such. So there's a very Eurocentric notion here of wilderness, and it'll become significant in a while how that is rather racist. Okie dokes. Excuse me. Now, I think at this point it's a good idea to give a brief history of ecological ideas. This isn't necessarily the science of ecology. It's of the main ideas that have popped up as scientists and intellectuals generally became more aware of how organisms interrelated and behaved. So ecology as a science is roughly 150 years old, and we'll get to the person who coins it. But of course the ideas predate that by a long way, as we saw with Linnaeus. So the main ideas are the relationships between organisms, by which is meant who eats whom and who works with whom and so forth. Successions of ecotypes, I'll come to that in a minute. The concept of an ecological niche, a place in the economy of nature. The idea of a food chain, and the idea of homeostasis, that a healthy ecosystem is something that is in a static nature, that maintains itself. The term ecology is etymologically identical with the term economy. It's not an accident either. It comes originally from the Greek word oikos and logia, to speak of the house or to speak of family property. So it's the knowledge of or the science of the household. Economy came to be seen as a very important concept in the 18th century, as we know, and the economy of nature itself was introduced by Linnaeus. Now, I'll come back to the economic aspects in a little bit, but the natural order under this view is seen as rational, that is, as something where everything has a purpose and a role, there's no wastage, it's functioning in an Enlightenment sense of rational principles. And the implication of this view of the economy of nature is that intervention will usually do more damage than good. In 1866, a German Darwinian by the name of Ernst Haeckel used the term ecology. It had been used, I believe, earlier than that, but it didn't really take off until Haeckel took Darwin's notion of the conditions of existence to mean, and named it basically ecology. Now, of course, as the second quote there shows, he meant the conditions of the struggle for existence. His view was that nature is competitive, that there are good and bad relations between organisms, that it's the foundations of natural selection. If anyone could be called Darwin's bulldog, it'd be Ernst Haeckel. But in the 1860s, people were starting to look at the interactions between organisms, and Haeckel was something of a polymath when it comes to biology. He was across nearly all of it. So around this time we start to get the beginnings of a formal study of ecology. Francois-Alphonse Forel-Lehmann, I'm not sure which is his surname there, I would guess Lehmann, but he published a Monographie limnologique, sorry, told you I didn't learn French. And this was a study of the environmental conditions of organisms in Lake Geneva. Now, a lot of ecologists come from around that area, and consequently Lake Geneva and the Austrian Alps and places like that were considered the first places to really study things. And of course, they studied in the spirit of Humboldt. Lehmann coined the term limnology as the study of lakes, and I kid you not, I once knew a limnologist named Peter Lake. Edouard Suess, no relation to Dr. Seuss, came up with the concept of the biosphere in 1875. So we're starting to see some fairly solid conceptual work being done in ecology. But I think probably the first really significant ecologist is this fellow, Eugen Warming, who was a Danish ecologist. And his first research focused on the interactions of plant communities, the ecology of plants, in 1895, in which he said the ecological geography of plants, and by which he means where they are and what conditions they live under, shall give an account of which natural communities occur, which economy characterizes it, and why species with different economies can be so closely associated as is often the case. It thus needs to be based on an understanding of the physical, etc., characteristics of the localities. What's really interesting about this is that he is attempting to come up with general principles of ecology based on local studies, and this is still something that happens today. He's responsible for the first university course in ecology, and he came up with the notion, which was incredibly influential, of ecological succession. So, if you take a site which is basically just bare rock, it will be successively colonized by different types of plants. This was actually studied when Krakatoa blew up. the islands had been thoroughly sterilised, and people started to visit the remnant islands in order to see in what order things would colonise the bare rock. And according to Warming, there's what he calls Zerach succession on bare rock. Lichens and mosses start to generate soils. You get annual herbs, then you get perennial herbs, scrubs, and forest. Likewise, if you run it in reverse, you end up with an ecological catastrophe. So this is the point at which catastrophic ecological problems start to be considered and studied. Now, in the mid-1900s, a British zoologist by the name of Charles Elton, I think he was at Cambridge, I'm not sure, started studying animal ecology. He was a zoologist, and as a result, he started to study two concepts that he came up with. One is the ecological niche, and the other is the food chain. Now, a niche in classical architecture is a place in the wall where you put your statues of the gods or ancestors or whatever. So it's a specific place appointed for those idols. An ecological niche, therefore, is a specific place that is occupied by only one type of organism. It's an abstract concept, not a physical concept. It basically means a part in the economy of nature. Like a butcher has a particular part in the economy, according to Adam Smith at any rate. The food chain is a slightly more complicated concept, so I'll come back to that. But here is an example of an ecological niche. There are three species of warbler that occupy different places, literally different places, in spruce tree forests. Now, the bay-breasted warbler feeds in the middle part of the tree, and by feeding I mean eats the insects that occupy there. The Cape May warbler behaviourally tends to live in the top of the tree, and so eats the organisms there, and the yellow-rumped warbler feeds in the lower part of the tree and at the bases of middle branches. And this means that they're not actually in competition with each other, even though they have similar lifestyles and morphologies. Elton generalized this to the idea that all organisms strive to occupy one ecological niche, and if they are successfully challenged in that niche, they will go extinct. The second thing, and this is, I think, something that is much more significant to us, is the notion of a food chain, or as we now call it, a trophic web. This is basically about the exchange of matter and energy from the base of the web, which are often autotrophic organisms like moss and fungi, because they can generate food sources just basically from having a place to be, some water and some sunlight. The others are heterotrophic, and they take and break down the materials of previous organisms, and you can see here in this particular one you get a flow of energy to these fungi, bacteria, pill bugs, as we call them, slaters here in Australia, insect larvae, crickets and so forth, and they themselves become food for things that are, quote, higher in the web. Now, what you tend to find with a trophic web is that more energy is consumed by fewer organisms as you ascend the web. So This is typically why we have apex predators. These are organisms which absorb the most energy in their food, but which have far fewer numbers. They require many orders of magnitude of organisms to feed them effectively. Alrighty. Okay, a little bit later we get Arthur Tansley, another British ecologist, and he studied the integration of plant and animal ecology. So here we start to see somebody who is looking at animals as both food for for plants in terms of their carcasses and so forth, and also which eat plants. And the trophic web, of course, is now including a far broader range of organisms. He looks like the very prototype of a British scientist in the 1950s, a boffin as they would call them in the movies. And I think he also came up with this notion of an ecosystem, which is a locale where particular interactions occur more or less independently of other locales. So while water may come in from outside the ecosystem, the lakes and ponds and creeks and what have you are localized in terms of what organisms live within them. And basically, for these sorts of things, if it's an ecosystem, then it's a type of ecosystem that is instantiated, that exists in one place. But the boundaries of ecosystems are incredibly vague, and this is to be expected because there is always interchange of material and energy and migration and so forth between different ecosystems. So this is something to bear in mind. Now, ecology focused our attention on the health and the well-being of ecosystems, and as a result, one of the things we started to notice was the effects of war, industry, farming and so forth on the environment. This became particularly important after the Second World War, but we've seen cases of this happening since. Vietnam is still recovering, and Southeast Asia. We're also seeing the effects of chemical pollution, and there's concern about nuclear weapons and what effect they would have on the environment. There are still regions of the world where atomic tests made the area uninhabitable, and including in Australia. There is a place that the British tested their nuclear bombs back in the 50s and 60s. So how do we come to our basic ideas of modern ecology? In large part, they're due to these two brothers, Eugene and Howard Odum. Now, Odum, the elder, Eugene, was a bit of a theoretical ecologist, and he held that at its climax, that is, once it was fully mature, an ecosystem would be in equilibrium and it would resist changes from without. This meant that you should not, in your conservation efforts, attempt to change an ecosystem. You should attempt to restore it to homeostasis. His brother, who was also an ecologist, was very influential on the American legal and political system and drafted a number of laws to protect the environment under this assumption. So Odom and his colleagues published a book called The Fundamentals of Ecology. First one was in 1953. And this educated several generations of American ecologists and thus was very influential to ecology in the rest of the world, given the preeminence of American ecological approaches largely due to their funding. So under the homeostasis view, he held that an ecosystem would be a steady state. It's not really held anymore. Since the 50s, we've come to realize that a lot of ecosystems cycle in their states. They go through periods of extended drought and periods of extended flooding, something which Australians are all too familiar with. But he came up with this idea of the chemistry of an ecosystem, largely based around nitrogen and methane and ammonia and so forth. So in his view, an ecosystem was something that remained stable and which carried out energy transfers through these chemical reactions and so on. I suspect that's true of the ecosystems he studied. I don't know if it's true of every ecosystem. All right, so let's just briefly go through a history of environmentalism. As we've seen, there were people in Europe and Britain and America in the late 19th century who were nascent environmentalists. They'd started to do what we would now call conservation biology. But mostly it started out as a way of having to deal with environmental problems for humans. For instance, this is a town called Widnes in Cheshire in the late 19th century. It was incredibly polluted and people died from the coal that was burnt in the area, from the smoke and the haze. London had its famous fogs from the burning of coal and was just generally very unhealthy. And during the 19th century, people started to become aware of these health issues. London had a real problem with sewage because as seems to be happening in Britain now, they simply dumped sewage into the rivers and into the sea. And in 1858, the stink was so bad that members of Parliament actually convened outside the Parliament, away from the Parliament buildings in the country, because the stink people couldn't cope with it. This led to the first form of legislation against pollution should be noted, in a urban environment. So it started a hygiene movement. It led to a number of cholera epidemics, which those of you who studied public health know the real Jon Snow, not the guy from Game of Thrones, mapped cases of cholera and found that there was a poisoned well, which he blocked off, and the cholera epidemic in that region stopped. This added to the public desire for legislation against pollution. There was also an extensive uptick in tuberculosis. It became so common that they used to refer to it as the wasting disease. This was due to overcrowding, of course, and a lack of hygiene. So, the initial attempts were to regulate waste disposal and air pollution. this led to replacement for wood burning and coal burning, gas burners and the like. These massive sewers, the ones that are still in place in London, are still being used and haven't really been upgraded since, are in use to take the waste and take it right out into the sea rather than dumping it into the Thames. That, of course, just puts the problem elsewhere. And, of course, these days we treat the waste so that we retain the water and can dispose of the organic material in ways that are useful and or clean. But a byproduct of this was that we started to protect the environment, and it became increasingly common knowledge that you needed an unspoilt environment, which basically meant at the time not a built-up environment, for human beings to have recreation in order for their health. And that started not just the health movement of the latter 19th century, which led to such things as the Boy Scouts and a thing called muscular Christianity in the 1880s, but also people started to consider, for example, the fens and the moors in England as important to maintain. In America, wilderness was particularly important, and this isn't surprising because the American nation moves from the settled colonies of the west, of the east of the continental United States, and starts to move into the west. And as they do, they encountered new landscapes that had been unknown to Europeans previously. One of the most significant was the Yosemite Valley, which was regarded as a mountain cathedral, that is a natural church. And it was close enough to where the railways would be built that it became a tourist destination. One of the first, I think, natural tourist destinations in the world. And it was regarded as absolutely beautiful. And a particular guy, a particular artist, Alfred Bierstadt, German romantic painter, did a series of paintings, very large paintings, they're massive, of scenes at both Yosemite and Yellowstone and other places in the wilderness, which were hung up in galleries in the east, and people became fascinated with these grandiose and significant landscapes. And one in particular, the Niagara Falls, which was accessible to the east quite easily, became not just a tourist destination, but a place of recreation. People would go there, stay there, and enjoy the sights and sounds of the one of the biggest waterfalls in North America. However, more than that, America saw itself as a frontier society. That is, a society which was being built at the intersection of the civilized world, that is to say the developed part of the country, and the uncivilized, which was to say the country that was being wasted on American Indians. And here is a famous painting, American Progress, which gives you an idea of what people thought at the time. You'll see the heroic settlers, the farmers, the woodsmen, the coaches, the building of the trains, and of course the fleeing Indians left there. And the fact that it's light in the civilized world and dark in the uncivilized world is about as unsubtle a message as you're likely to come across. Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 wrote a book called The Frontier in American History, in which he built the frontiers myth. This is the idea that America is defined as a frontier society. Right? It's the quintessential American encounter of civilization with an unlimited wilderness, and presumably also, therefore, an unlimited economic growth. I'll read this at least some of it. The frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress industries, tools, modes of travel and thought. It takes him from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and the moccasin. At the frontier, the environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish. Little by little he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe. Fact is that here is a new product that is American. At first, the frontier was the Atlantic coast. It was the frontier of Europe in a very real sense. Moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines. The frontier is determined by the reaction between wilderness and the edge of expanding settlement. They do love to create national myths in America, and this is one of the most widely held views in America, even today, when every part of America is either developed or is wasteland. Personal anecdote: when I visited a friend in Phoenix, he took me out into the Arizona desert, and we stopped and walked some distance, and everywhere I looked, were bullet casings. Everywhere. You know, large rifle casings, pistol casings. There's probably more copper in the American desert now than there was in the original mines. It's just ridiculous. And yet the reason for this focus on shooting in the wild has a lot to do with this frontier myth. They see themselves as continuing the tradition of rugged individualism in a wild environment. So in 1964, the US Federal Wilderness Act was signed into law, and this created national wilderness preservation as a system and defined wilderness as an area where Earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. It further defines wilderness as the area of undeveloped federal land, retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions. Now, what could be problematic with that is that this included areas where American indigenous Indians had lived for at least 15 to 20,000 years, and where they had made considerable changes to the ecology in virtue of their hunting, their use of the land and the land's resources. Moreover, a considerable portion of the indigenous Americans were sedentary and built very large settlements, if not cities. And this was all wiped away by these definitions. And this is a generic problem in the American context. So this led to what we would now call the conservationist movement, but was centered around national parks. John Muir, who was a Scottish migrant to the United States, disseminated ideas of conserving the wilderness through the national parks movement, and he became a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's before Teddy Roosevelt became president. His justification for it was twofold. On the one hand, there was a romantic view that there was something about the trees and the forests which would speak to people, that they would be able to go into the wilderness and restore themselves. So this is new. Previously, national parks have been seen as preserving timber and rivers, and also to an extent, as we've already talked about, allowing people to hunt. Okay, but the conservation idea is based on a primeval solitude which ignored the presence of non-European people. In Yellowstone, lands have been used by 7 different native tribes, and 15 years after the establishment of the national park, they were driven out by the army, and the public told that the Indians had vanished and the park was now in a natural condition. However, they needed to manage it pretty much the same way that the Indians had, in order to make it pleasing to the eye. So the features of Yellowstone that Muir found so attractive were the very things that the American Indians had maintained. Now, we've seen similar things here with Indigenes all around the world. In Australia, we've seen that their management of the land makes the land what is attractive, particularly in Kakadu National Park, around Uluru, up in the Kimberleys, and so forth. So this is a lesson that could have been learned a lot earlier than it has been, if indeed it has been. Now, there were nature reserves in Europe before the national parks, and they too were tied into this romantic Humboldtian view of the natural world. So the Prussian state government purchased an area in 1836 to preserve its beauty. In 1858, a primeval forest was protected in Bohemia. 1865, commons were legislated as preserved areas in England, after the commons had basically been abandoned throughout England in the preceding couple of centuries. The National Trust was founded in 1895, largely to preserve older buildings and their estates. And in 1909, Sweden established a European National Park. These rapidly spread. I cannot remember when Australia's first national parks or state parks were established, but we too did this. And in particular, around Sydney, you'll find that there's national parks which are very close to the centre of the city, and in fact constrain its ability to expand. Not a bad thing, considering the quality of these areas. Now, in 1960, I want to say 3 or 2. Okay, Rachel Carson, who was she had a master's in zoology back in the days when master's degrees meant pretty much what PhDs mean today. She worked for the Bureau of Fishes, in the course of which she observed and wrote her observations about the sea. And these were under the sea wind, the edge of the sea, and the sea around us. Now, these were immensely popular. She turned out to be a very good writer, and on the basis of her earnings from these books, she was able to become a full-time professional nature writer. Now, this is in an era when science writing was generally done by scientists and not by professional writers. But her next book was a thing that basically shook not only the United States but the rest of the world. She published a book called Silent Spring. And the idea here was that the overuse of pesticides, and in particular DDT, she was observing that insects were dying. And because the insects were dying, the birds were disappearing, and she imagined a world where all the insects had died and there were no birds, and there would be no crops, and so on and so forth. And she was quite right about DDT, although the chemical industry tried the classic example that what she was doing was bad science, and they tried to denigrate her, and they employed scientists to take their view. This is straight out of the playbook of Manufacturing Dissent, which Noam Chomsky has written about, and more recently the idea that tobacco could be treated this way, the oil industry could treat it this way, the pharmaceutical industry could treat it this way. Anything that interfered with profits and business as usual, they would mount a PR campaign. Now, when I say a PR campaign, it's an actual PR campaign. It's not just PR in the sense that they were getting out there and making statements in the press. They were running a full public relations campaign run by some of the leading public relations firms in America at the time. And these same firms also had run tobacco PR, oil PR, and so on. It's the same corporate bodies. However, she basically won the day, in part because she convinced President Kennedy's administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency was established. And that, of course, set the tone for countries around the world, including Australia. So, to summarise, environmentalism wasn't just based on the romantic view. It wasn't a spiritual movement per se. But neither was it based on selfish interests alone. It was a mixture of the two. There were economic virtues in environmentalism. There were personal concerns about pollution, acid rain, dumping in rivers and so forth. All of these things are still with us, even 50, 60, 70 years later. The environmentalist movement faced a considerable kickback from industry, and as a result, what we've got now is basically a competition between those who are benefiting from the exploitation and damage to the environment, and those who wish to protect it for whatever reason there is. Okay. Now, our next half will be looking at a metaphor in which people have been calling the world on which we live our spaceship. And the aim here is to show that we don't have an alternative, despite Elon Musk and various other billionaires. Okie dokes, we'll see you then. Welcome back. So I mentioned in the first half that Edward Seuss came up with the idea of a biosphere. And as far as we know, the biosphere is restricted to more or less about 100 kilometres above and below sea level. As far as we've encountered various forms of single-celled organisms that live as much as 20-25 kilometres below the Earth's crust. I doubt that we'll find any further, but I'm just allowing 100 kilometres for ease. And we know that there are bacteria in clouds and therefore almost certainly in the troposphere. But again, 100 kilometres is a convenient cutoff. And all the life that we know, every bit of living biology, of traces of the past, all of it exists in that 200 kilometre thick shell around the Earth's sea, which means that there's not very much of the universe that has actually got life in it. And yet we send spacecraft to try and find evidence of life on other planets and moons, and we hope that life will be found there for no good reason. That is to say, there's no indication that there's life there. There are some indications of organic chemistry going on Mars. That's understandable. Any planet which has had water on it is probably going to have had organic chemistry, but not necessarily organic chemistry generated by living systems. Nevertheless, people have used this metaphor of spaceship Earth, that it's a complicated life support system for humans, and that as the crew we have to act together to ensure that our life support systems work. It's in its modern form associated with this photo, the famous Earthrise photo from Apollo 8 on Christmas Day 1968. There are ideas that have emerged in the course of the 20th century about cybernetics, which includes feedback and feed-forward loops, and systems theory. But the idea and the metaphor that we are on a ship of some sort goes back quite a way. Okay, here is a quote from a publication in 1879 that the Earth is a well-provisioned ship, this on which we sail through space. And George Orwell, in his Road to Wigan Pier, wrote, "The world is a raft sailing through space with potentially plenty of provisions for everybody. The idea that we must all cooperate and see to it that everyone does his fair share of the work and gets his fair share of the provisions seems so blatantly obvious that one would say no one could possibly fail to accept it unless he had some corrupt motive for clinging to the present system." In other words, this is the old tragedy of the commons argument coming to play. Is it the case that we need some sort of commonwealth in our political organizations, or is it the case that so long as we've got people making money out of the present system, that we'll always have poverty and so forth? Orwell had a particular political point to make. This guy, who stood for the American presidency and became the UN representative for the United States, gave a speech to the UN in 1965 in which he said, "We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent on its vulnerable reserves of air and soil, all committed for our safety to its security and peace. Preserved from annihilation only by the care, the work, and I will say the love we give our fragile craft. We cannot maintain it half fortunate, half miserable, half confident, half despairing, half slave to the ancient enemies of man, half free in a liberation of resources undreamed of until this day. No craft, no crew can travel safely with such vast contradictions. On their resolution depends the survival of us all. Now that's 60 years ago. And it's pretty obvious that Stevenson was being incredibly optimistic. Whether he actually thought that this would have an effect or not, it didn't. There are some things that were done in the 60s and early 70s, but after that it looks like the corrupt supporters of the present system kicked back. Here's another one. This is Buckminster Fuller in 1968, the height of the hippie movement and the summer of love and all that. We can make all of humanity successful through science's world engulfing industrial evolution, provided that we are not so foolish as to continue to exhaust in a split second of astronomical history the orderly energy savings of billions of years. Energy conservation aboard our spaceship Earth. These energy savings have been put into our spaceship's life regeneration guaranteeing bank account for use only in self-starter functions. What he's basically saying is that the use of fossil fuels here is something that kickstarts industry. It should not be expected to maintain it. Now, Buckminster Fuller no doubt wanted to see nuclear power, or at least fusion power, as the way to provide energy to the world. And this debate goes on still. But you can see that the idea that we are in a space capsule that travels through the universe is one of those rhetorical tropes that people use a lot, and it relies strongly upon the idea that the Earth is a system. Now, in the 1950s, the idea of a system became more than just a metaphor. People were starting now to make actual physical systems. And so they were also thinking about what is it that makes something a system. Now here's an example of the application of the systems approach to conservation and biology in general. The fundamental concepts that recur most often in the biological, ecological, and economical models can easily be grouped into several major categories: energy and its use, flows, cycles and stocks, communication networks, catalysts and transforming agents, the readjustment of equilibriums, stability, growth and evolution, and above all, the concept of the system, living system, economic system, ecosystem, that binds together all the others. Each of these concepts applies to the cell as it does to the economy, to an industrial company as it does to ecology. Beyond the vocabulary, the analogies and the metaphors, there appears to exist a common approach that makes it possible to understand better and describe better organized complexity. This is from a book by Joël de Rosnay called The Macroscope in 1979. And here he shows how systems work. Sorry, I'm just trying to organize my thoughts here. If you have a look at this, he shows in the 1940s, it was, I can't quite see it. Machine leads to organism. In the 1950s, it was machine leads to organism leads to machine. In the 1960s, the systems approach was machine to organism to industry to society, and that fed to ecosystem, which back fed to society and so forth. So you get these flows of things, of causes and influences, as well as materials and energy. And at the bottom here, He shows this as a kind of timeline of theories and ideas, most of which seem to have come out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at the time. He also proposed that you can see a city as a system. This is also to be found in Charles Dyke's book, The Evolutionary Dynamics of Complex Systems, a study in biosocial complexity, which I believe was overlooked in terms of its importance at the time. But you can see here you have inputs, you have outputs. The inputs are energy, food, water, raw materials. The system is the city. It processes those. Taxes and labour are made possible by these inputs. The outputs are the wastes that acts on the environment, and the environment feeds back by in reaction to that back to the city, which is how pollution and other failures of the materials that you need for the city come to be. Now, I just want to say a few words about the differences between an economy and an ecology. I think an ecology is a real thing. I think that there are systems in the natural world, quite independently of human beings, that share through trophic webs and across ecosystems energy and matter. And as a result, organisms are either able to survive or not, and so on and so forth. But an economy, in my view, and this is not something you have to agree with, but I think an economy is an abstraction. I don't think it's a real thing. I don't think it's a physical thing. I don't even think it's a social thing. The social things that we call the economy are interactions between actors in society. And yet, those actors working together set up networks of trade and resource use that influences the ecologies, either overexploits them or treats them as fair use and makes sure that there's going to be future as well as current production. And renewable energies both improves the overall impact of society on the ecology, but at the same time can have deleterious effects. Like, for example, if you cover the desert with solar panels on the assumption that the desert is wasteland or wilderness, you're actually covering the ecosystems for a range of living things, some of which might be evolutionarily on the verge of extinction. So, you know, nothing is without a cost. Moreover, ecosystems influence economics. So when regions degrade to the point that you can't farm them or live in them, when sea levels rise and habitability, for example, one of the largest river deltas in the world is Bangladesh. Millions upon millions of people live there, and a small rise in the sea level, and we're looking at some large rises in the sea level, but a small rise in the sea level is going to make homeless millions of people. They won't be able to make food, they won't be able to live, so it's going to cause massive disruption. Moreover, ecosystems involve exploiting the materials that are in economic practices involve exploiting ecosystems to the point where, for example, we see more crossover diseases, or zoonoses as they're called, such that they spill over from but previously more or less isolated populations of animals to human society as we clear forests and so on. And that's exactly what's happened with the COVID-19 outbreak. Okay, it's a pandemic because this was a particular type of virus that was everywhere amongst the bat population of South Asia. And by clearing the forests to the point where the bats are now leaving their droppings in human food production or food sources is an inevitable recipe for this sort of pandemic. Now, de Rosnay and other systems theorists, I'll talk a bit about some of them later, see social systems as causal links between social institutions, basically. If you are of a mind to see society as a series of wholes that not H-O-L-E-S, but W-H-O-L-E-S, then each institution is a whole that produces something that affects other institutions. If, on the other hand, you're inclined, as I am, to see this as people interacting with their environment in a physical fashion as well as the other people, then you see this as a sort of a shorthand way of talking about complex systems. Either way, we have complexity in both nature and in human behavior. And in the 1980s, a particular theory of agents and actors was developed, beginning with Bruno Latour and other sociologists, where systems in the social sense comprise agents and elements. Agents are active, they do work. Now, an agent can be a living thing, it can be a different system, for example, a volcanic or tectonic system. It can be human, or it can be animal, or maybe even ensembles of plants, who knows. But the idea here is this is a generic way of thinking about systems. And the other thing that occurs in an actor network is that the agents do work with elements, that is, with specific resources and parts. So in an ecosystem, agents are organisms, including humans. But a network is something that you need to explain, and if it's sufficiently complex, then it's very difficult to explain how the network functions. So actor network theory proposes that you look at the relations between agents and the elements that they employ to do the explaining. Both economics and ecology shows up as networks with actors. Now, I put that there as a way for you to think about what a system might be. I remember as an undergraduate trying to define system before I'd read any of this stuff, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't come up with a way of thinking about it. So this is a way to think about a complex system that might be useful to you. And complex networks are very often quite resilient to change. This is cited up the top here is a paper in Nature from 2016, where they argued that patterns in complex networks are hard to change. We'll come to a caveat about that in a minute, but this is a kind of homeostasis view of complex networks and systems. And we know what happened to that in ecology. I want you to watch this now. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
To live on Earth is to live as part of a network. A giant web where almost every creature depends on others for survival. These networks are so complex that it's difficult to predict how resilient they might be to changing conditions. Let's take an ecosystem in Australia, where certain plants have a symbiotic relationship with various ants. The ants act as bodyguards protecting the plants, who in return provide food and shelter for the ants. But it's not like every kind of plant has its own species of ant. That would be much too easy. In fact, each ant can visit a variety of plants, and each plant benefits from the protection of a number of different kinds of ant. You can see how quickly a network becomes very complicated. Let's take all the plants in the ecosystem and draw lines between any two species that share the same ants. This ecosystem can be represented by a network. The plants are the nodes and the connecting lines are the ants. Two plants are linked if they share at least one ant species. If they share more than one, the link is even stronger. By helping the ants, these plants are also indirectly helping each other. The success of one plant might lead to more ants, which could benefit another plant. Having lots of connections also means the network can adapt to change. For example, along the bottom is a list of all the ant species in the system. If one of these ants disappears, the network can compensate. It's resilient. Up to a point. As we remove ant species at random one by one, the connections in the network grow weaker and start to disappear. As we go along, as well as losing whole plant species, the abundance of remaining species gradually decreases as well. There comes a key point for every network where the population of the remaining species suddenly crashes. The network can no longer compensate for further changes. Where this point comes represents the network's resilience. This resilience is usually thought to be completely unpredictable, as it varies so much between different networks. But researchers have developed a new tool to try and simplify things. They started with complex multidimensional networks, all with different properties. The clever part is then using various mathematical techniques to transform all these networks into a standard model, in which the crash is always in the same place. This means that the resilience of the original networks is now predictable. This can be useful in predicting how ecosystems might react to environmental changes. Climate change, for example, can affect all species in a network and their relationships, weakening the strength of all the connections. This can make the resilience of a network so low that it might only take the removal of a handful of species to bring about complete collapse. This is particularly worrying for already fragile ecosystems, in which a tiny change could cause the extinction of a whole host of plants and animals. That's why it's important to have tools to predict and prevent these catastrophic network failures, like the disappearance of honeybees or unexpected collapses in commercial fisheries. And these models don't just apply to ecological systems. The same tools can be used to examine networks of people, from social networks to the spread of epidemics, banking networks in a financial crisis, and even networks of air traffic, in which a single problem could cause huge delays. Models of all these things are often available already, based on specific real-world data, but these new mathematical tools can be applied generally to a whole range of different systems. They should allow us to predict how any network will respond to change, and could even suggest specific strategies for preventing catastrophic damage. Whether it's plants, planes, or people, we may be a little closer to understanding the giant, complex networks of our planet.
so I hope that I've shown you that the planet is indeed a system and that systems thinking is necessary. We will probably talk a little bit more about this, but there's one person I haven't mentioned here, and that's a fellow called von Bertalanffy. Now, von Bertalanffy was Hungarian, I believe, or German, one of the two, who and he started thinking about systems theory, and very many of the ideas that are in play in systems thinking, in particular in systems biology, were first proposed by him. His full name is Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And you'll encounter him quite a lot, so keep an eye open. And I think that's it. See if I can close this. And that. Alrighty, so I hope that you found this interesting. Have at it in the discussions and in the tutes. Cheers.